Well, Al Jazeera journalist Dorothy Parvaz has been released after being held in detention for 19 days. She disappeared after arriving in Syria to cover the protests on April the 19th. She was later deported to Iran. Well, I'm glad to say that Dorothy is safe and well, is now back with us in Doha. And I'm very pleased to say she joins us in the studio now. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. It was so great to see you safely back. I've been hearing a little about what you've been saying about conditions that you were held in Syria, and they were fairly grim.
Yes, in fact, things in Syria are pretty bad. For me, I felt like just a visitor there. I didn't feel that it would be a permanent state for me. What was worse was realizing that Syrian youth, many of them having nothing to do with protests and some of them having something to do with them, just being hauled in almost arbitrarily off the streets and being held in captivity with no rights, no way of contacting their families, some being beaten severely.
Subjected to brutality as well.
Absolute severity. The beatings I heard almost around the clock were savage.
That must have been one of the most scary things, hearing what was going on around you and not knowing what was going to happen to you.
Well, right. The first night I was there, they took me out blindfolded and handcuffed into a courtyard. I'm fairly certain for that purpose, to scare me. And I heard two separate interrogations and beatings. And these young men, they sounded very young. They sounded in their late teens or early 20s. Being beaten so harshly, and their voices were hoarse. I don't know what kind of answers they were expecting from these young men, but all they got was wallahi, wallahi, or just, no, no, or please stop, that sort of thing in Arabic, nothing else.
Did they give you any reason as to why you were being held? Is it because you were a journalist?
Well, initially the impression I was given was that at the airport was that I might be a U.S. spy for Israel, for the Zionist regime. But then it became quite clear that the fact that I worked for Al Jazeera was a huge problem. They equated Al Jazeera with Human Rights Watch for causing problems for them, was how it was put to me by my interrogator.
And were you aware of the huge media coverage surrounding your disappearance and efforts to find out where you were?
No. No, not until I was in Iran. My interrogator gave me some hints that people had started to wonder where I was, but no, I had no idea. I really felt like nobody knew where I was, who I was, aside from obviously my colleagues.
So you were
friends.
held in Syria and then you were moved to Iran?
Correct. I was in Syria for 3 days and then I was rather forcefully extradited to Iran by 3 men dragging me onto a plane, kicking and screaming. They told me I was being returned to Qatar, but they misinformed me. So I arrived in Iran, where obviously the Iranian government had to follow through the process of dealing with someone they were told was a spy.
And how were you treated in Iran?
In Iran, I was treated very well. I felt I was treated fairly and according to law. It's not the same as U.S. law, obviously. You just have to be aware of that. But my interrogator was always polite. I was not subjected to any foul treatment. My room was clean. I was given adequate medical treatment when I needed it.
Well, yeah. when you were held in Syria, I mean, how did you cope? Were you kept on your own? How did you sort of pass the time?
Moved around. So the first night I was in 3 different cells, and then the third cell I was in, I shared with a teenage girl who was 19 and quivered every time she heard a beating, which was almost around the clock, and her only assurance was that women were not beaten. She pled repeatedly with guards, crying to allow her to speak to her parents, but it was not allowed, and she couldn't understand why she'd been swept off the streets, essentially arbitrarily, and brought into this place.
You said a lot of these people were young people. Were they protesters? Yes. Were they people protesting against the regime?
No, I don't believe that's the case. Perhaps some were, but for example, the first cell I was in with a young woman who was 24, 25 years old. She had a pair of stiletto high heels in the cell with her. Now, those are not shoes anybody wears when they're about to participate in a protest. I saw another man shackled to a radiator, basically being forced to, it seemed, write a confession, but he was quivering so hard he couldn't even write. So I don't really think a lot of these people even knew what to confess to, let alone have anything to say about the government.
So when you knew that you were finally being released and you were finally being returned to Doha, I mean, what was your reaction? What do friends and family have to say?
Intense relief, not because I have anything against being in Iran, but there's something to be said for being held in a locked room without knowing that your family knows that you're okay. I'm very fortunate to be back here and back at work, and I'm looking forward to going back and visiting my family soon.
Well, we wish you all the best, Dorothy, and it is good to see you safe and well. Thank you very much indeed for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me.